So we're now going to change a little bit from the digital imperative, and we're going to move into the world of data. But very importantly, not just big data, but small data. And we're very happy to have one of what Time magazine called one of the world's 100 most influential people. He's an author, and his latest book called Small Data, Tiny Clues That Uncover Huge Trends, has actually been my train companion for the last week or so. I have a long commute in from Connecticut every day into New York City, and has kept me very entertained and really made me think long and hard about how we look at consumers and understand them. And so just before I do the introduction, what I'd like to do is introduce a video that if we can just roll the video, please.
When you travel the world as much and for as long as I have, you repeatedly catch sight of just one topic. That's the human being. The fact is, we all believe we're truly distinct. The reality is that all 7 billion of us are all the same. I would say that there are between 500 and 1,000 distinct types of humans in the world. I'm one of them, and so are you. Clues are everywhere. The reality is that no one sees them. A clue could be as simple as a glance or a toothbrush. It could be a painting, a photograph, or how a family's shoes are arranged. Just as distinct as a drop of blood, a person's home is a true reflection of their spirit. It's not just what you see, it's how it's placed. Clue gathering is not linear. Some clues lead nowhere. Some clues are so small that even I don't notice them at first. I call these clues, these insights into people's lives, small data. I listen to what people like and what they don't like, what they need and what they really want. The pieces of the puzzle come together and create an entirely new picture. In the end, everything boils down to one simple thing: the consumer. And no matter how insignificant consumer observations may appear to be, I've learned that every single thing we do in life, consciously or unconsciously, reveals incredible insights about who we really are. I'm a compulsive collector of clues, an explorer of small data.
So everybody, if you can please welcome Martin Lindstrom.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Richard. I'm glad that you are reading my book on the train. I hope it's a really, really long train ride. Hey, everyone. I hope you're still awake. No, I'm a huge fan of Lego, and I was so thrilled last week because they just announced a record high profit of 31%. The history of Denmark and in particular Lego turned around last week. Now, all of you would probably say, that's pretty normal. I mean, Lego is played by everyone, right? But it wasn't like that just 13 years ago, where the company was close to bankruptcy. It was interesting because back then they were listening a lot to big data. And one of the observations the guys at Lego had learned was that the instant gratification generation had arrived. A generation which had no patience for anything whatsoever. So they had to change the size of the Lego bricks from these tiny bricks to the gigantic building blocks. And they did it. They thought this is probably the answer. But during Christmas 2003, the company realized that those bricks were probably not the right answer. And that was the year where the Lego company was close to bankruptcy. Now, the story here really begins in an interesting, fascinating experience, because I'm not sure what happened here. But the story began some time ago where this Lego company suddenly said, well, we need to change our strategy. We can't rely on big data. So what they decided to do was to do something highly unusual. Instead of going into those big data, they basically decided to move into people's homes across Europe. And one day they found themselves in the home of an 11-year-old boy in Germany. And the team from Lego is saying to the kids, what are you most proud of? And the kid, he pauses for a second and he says, that one. And he pointed the shelf, and there he sees an old, worn-down pair of sneakers. He takes them down. And Lego was a bit surprised. I mean, they expected to receive an answer like a Play-Doh or some PlayStation or some Nintendo stuff, but that was really not the answer. It was this old, worn-down pair of sneakers. So they say, why? And the kid, he says, because it shows I'm the best skater in town. You see, if you're a skater, and I had no idea about this, if you're a good skater, you slide down this skateboard exactly at an angle of 12.5 degrees, and it creates a wear and a tear on the side of these sneakers, which means that he had his trophy, and that's exactly what he said. So this young kid, in fact, was telling an amazing insight to Lego. Because Lego realized that if this is true, then they've been completely wrong. In fact, the instant gratification generation was wrong. The answer was rather that if you give time and if you give the storytelling to kids, suddenly time is not in essence. In fact, they have all the time they need in the world. So Lego did two things. They changed the size of the Lego brick back from those gigantic building blocks to the tiny bricks, added even more bricks to the whole thing. And they also began the process of developing the Lego movie. This is a story about how small data, as I call it, seemingly insignificant observations made in our homes or in our lives, in one way or another, are defining us. And as we just heard from the guys from Mars and Tribal, that human insight is incredibly difficult to find through big data. We need to find it somewhere else, and that somewhere else is really not in a warehouse. One thing which is fascinating for me is that when I look at cases from around the world, one of the cases we worked with was for a major bank. And this bank here in the United States was struggling. They basically said, well, we have a huge amount of churn. People changing account all the time, moving in and out. We have a problem. So they decided to go back to the drawing board, create amazing letters, send it out to the customers and saying, we apologize, you obviously don't like us. But just a couple of days before they're sending out those letters, they went back to the drawing board and said, hey, have you talked to those consumers? And they did that for just a half a day and realized the reason why there was this amount of churn out there was in fact because people are going through a divorce. And the divorce basically meant that they would stay, they just wouldn't stay under the same conditions as they did before. The reality right now is that we have become so addicted to big data, in my opinion, that creativity has disappeared. I fundamentally believe that if we're going to come up with creative ideas in the future, we cannot necessarily only do it with this amount of data. We need to look at it slightly different. And that answer probably is going to be slightly different than what you expect. Back in 2012, do you remember when Google came up with this amazing finding that, in fact, they were able to predict a flu outbreak 5 days before it happened? Well, what was fascinating was that they were right. They did predict it 5 days before, and everyone was stunned by it. But what happened just recently was that the Center for Disease Control came back and assessed that these data were completely wrong. In fact, they were 2 times what they should have been. You see, when people type in this type of inquiry online, the neighbors suddenly want to type in as well, because that's interesting. I wonder what happens. What's the trend here? And suddenly this has a viral effect, which were not put into the data of those big data. What happened here was really that Google, well, they cared about the correlation rather than causation. I fundamentally believe that they should have cared about the causation followed by the correlation. Where you could say that the causation is big data, the correlation is the seemingly insignificant observations, those small data, helping to create those observations, or in many cases hypotheses, which are creating, in my opinion, amazing research work. I think it's very simple. I think we're getting to a point right now where it's not just a matter about big data anymore. I think we need to have a partner in a dance, a counterbalance. It takes two to tango, you could say. And I think that counterbalance may actually be what I define as small data. I define it as seemingly significant behavioral observation that point towards one or more unmet needs out there. And some of you may say, well, that's ethnographics. Well, it's not necessarily just that. It could be quite a lot of other things. What they have in common, though, is that we have a ton of data right now, but we really don't have information, in my opinion. And I think what we need to work on is to figure out, how do we create that feeling of love out there? I mean, you wouldn't pick your wife based on factual criteria. Women which are 6'7" tall turns me on. The last 4 digits in the cell phone number is whoa. And the Pantone color of her hair is absolutely nice. It's 2256, amazing color. You wouldn't say that, right? But that's the way we ask us to, in the creative field, to create creativity with love in it. Which I think is fundamentally wrong. So I think what we'll have to do probably is to ask ourselves the question, what do we then do instead of all this? Well, I want to give you just some numbers, just to be nice here and tick the box. Because just recently the Journal of Behavioral Psychology actually came up with a fascinating study where they showed the balance between instinct and calculated risk. And basically they said the forecast, where they asked people to forecast certain things based on logic and data, so big data, was on the left side, and you had the instinctual and small data down here at the horizontal level. Well, what they realized was, as all these data were put up here, that the sort of the highest peak of the data, in fact, was in the middle. In fact, the best and the most strongest overlap was exactly there. And the study concluded that exactly the most accurate forecast depends on both logic, which is big data, and intuition, which is in principle small data. But we don't do that anymore. We don't believe in our instinct anymore. But in many ways, if you want to predict the future, do you really want to go back and analyze data from the past only? Or don't you want to look a little bit into those seemingly insignificant observations which are indicating a little bit more of the future? I believe that life is all about balance. And I also believe that we get to a point right now where we're out of balance. We're all out of balance. That's life. I mean, whole nations are out of balance. Syria is out of balance. And it means that people are escaping. But individuals are also out of balance in many ways. And I think a good indication of that is that I either feel I'm too overweight, or maybe I feel I don't have friends, or whatever. But it's that out of balance, that gap, which is representing, in my opinion, an opportunity for a brand. That's really where the search should be in the end of the day. So these factors we see there, in principle, are all reflections of out of balance, and these balances are identified through these seemingly insignificant observations we make in people's home. And why do I tell you that? Well, I tell that because big data offers a sense of distance given to those who are comfortable sitting behind a screen with permission to do so. And I think a lot of us feel very comfortable about that, and I respect that. But I have a fundamental view that if you really want to study animals, don't go to the zoo, go to the Amazon, and I think we're afraid of that. I think really powerful research is to get the hands dirty. Over the last 10 years, I spent time in 2,000 consumers' homes across 77 countries living with them. It's not fun to live in Nigeria on mud or live in a favela somewhere in Brazil. but it makes you become alive. Because we are so obsessed with our devices right now, we're not present. But you guys own the essence of being present. That's your home. Because the CMO cannot have time for it, the CEO doesn't have time for it, the executive management doesn't have time for it. They outsource all of that to you guys. So you're sitting with the essence of what human beings are, in my humble opinion. This is me. I'm sleeping with the consumer, I tend to say. I get paid for that. And I just want to point out, I'm looking at the screen here, just so you know. I took this photo in Russia and Siberia as I moved in with people to understand things. And I guess just as a detective collects clues in order to solve a case, my role here is to pick up emotional DNA. And that emotional DNA then leads to something interesting. Have you thought about, guys, I want you guys to be honest just for a second. I assume many of you have a Facebook page. How many of you would say that your Facebook page is a complete mirror of who you really are? It's an honest reflection of who you are. Who would raise your hand? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.5 person. The half person is this one here, down there, I see. The issue is that we're not honest. The Facebook page in many ways for me is a picture of who we would like to be seen as to the world, not necessarily who we are. So I call that a perception land. And online is perception, but also offline there's something called perception. And I see that in the perception room. It's funny, we actually have a perception room in our homes. We realized as I went around the world. The perception room, by the way, you can find if you are looking for the coffee table book. If you're looking for that, you will find the perception room. This is, by the way, a room which are revealing a lot of stuff about us. I mean, stuff like this, that if you have an old antique piece of furniture, you're more likely to show to the world that you're a little bit more sophisticated than most stuff out there. You'll notice that if you have a huge, colorful painting hanging in your living room, quite often we see in correlation that people are more self-confident. I'm sure you can come and attack me with all sorts of numbers and saying, oh, we're not sure. But I have to say, time after time, we see those correlations. Or the most provocative one is this one, that when we go into people's home and we see huge shelves packed with books, quite often means that the education probably was not that solid, and we want to compensate for that in our lives. Maybe it's not always true, but that for me indicates imbalances, and it's there we're finding the foundation for a brand. The biggest transformation, by the way, I think we've seen is currently taking place in the bedroom, in teens' bedrooms. It's fascinating. I went to some kids' bedroom and lived with them some weeks ago. You know, young boys, they are using their cell phone in the shower now. I mean, it just shows you how transformation is dramatically changing out there. And think about it, the first light teens see every morning is the screen, and the last light they switch on is the cell phone. It's all blue light, morning and evening. But there's something else happening in the bedroom which I find fascinating. First of all, everything takes place in the bed. They're eating, they're sleeping, they're working, they're fighting, and they're doing everything in the bed right now. Which means that the entire room is reconfigured in a way you've never seen before. The bed is, by the way, always close to the PowerPoint. But beside that, there's something else which is interesting. A fashion chain asked us to change their brand in Europe, a larger fashion chain. And they said to us, why is our sales going down? Well, we went back. We couldn't see any reasons why it should go down according to the big data. So we started to talk to girls and realized that on average, a young girl in Europe is waking up 23 minutes earlier than she did just 10 years ago. Why? Well, if you ask girls about that, you will get all sorts of answers which have nothing to do with the truth. Boys, for that sake, too. We really couldn't find out why. So we started to spend time in the consumer homes. We took photos, and with permission from parents, we started to analyze why are they living differently. I want to show you some photos here. They're true photos from across Europe. And all of these photos, in many ways, are reflecting a retail revolution in Europe at the moment. Now, we went to the bathroom, we looked at the shower, and we realized something interesting in the shower cabin. We noticed that the hole in the shampoo was smaller than it was just 10 years ago. I know that from my work with P&D. We noticed that girls are spending more time using oil-based hand cream, which, by the way, was water-based just 10 years ago. And the facial cream is now water-based, not oil-based, as it was 10 years ago. They're using even more facial powder. Why? We couldn't understand why until 1 second. It just struck us. Of course. What is the first thing girls are doing when they wake up? Well, they have dry fingers. They use the fingers and slide with the fingers because it works suddenly, the display. And what's the first thing they're doing? They take a selfie of themselves. Because we realize that because if you use oil-based cream, it makes your face shine, right? So they put powder on instead. And then we went back to the big data. That's where we had the correlation. And realized they're not taking one selfie of themselves. Girls in Europe, on average, are taking 17 selfies of themselves. We realized when looking into girls' behavioral patterns in stores that also that changed. I was just doing the opening keynote for the American Bookseller Association the other day. So we spent a lot of time with booksellers. And as I observed girls watching and buying books, they did something dramatically different compared to just 10 years ago. They all went in groups. They would congregate around the most messy table looking like Instagram. Each girl would then read on the back of the book and pitch the book to each other. And if all of the girls loved this book, guess what? One girl would buy it. Well, we realized that was the insight to the 17 selfies. Because here's the issue. These girls were basically part of a tribe. And they wanted to make sure that that tribe was maintained. So these selfies were basically a way to fix up and make sure that their clothes would be according to the color scheme that day, that morning. By observing girls going into dressing rooms, again with permission if I may add, we also learned that they are not walking into the dressing rooms once or twice as a person. They go in 5 or 6 people at the same time. They're too small. So out of this, the conclusion was very simple. We did 2 things. We changed the size of the dressing rooms, put in a huge screen. You press the play button here, and with permission, it takes a photo of you, and you can now vote on what clothes you like the best with your best friends. 17% like your shoes. We also introduced 2 more seasons, so 6 seasons a year. So you're not running out of options, and sales went up. This is a story about small data. I think in the future we need a counterbalance. I don't think we need just to have the big numbers. I think we need to have the seemingly insignificant observations out there. And my hope is we can create a little bit of a movement. I've actually, I'll give you a password here if you're interested in this slideshow and all the videos you've seen. Just download that free of charge and run with it. Pretend like it's yours. Change it. Spread the word. Because for me, this is much more than just talking about numbers. I think it's about us talking about humans and life and creativity, which is fading away in a world right now. And I think you guys can be the guardian angels for that. I want to wrap up with a little quote. And by the way, you can follow me on Facebook and all that stuff out there. But if you should summarize this, it's very simple. I think some of the biggest innovations, some of the best creative campaigns, exactly what you said with Mars, I think some of those observations out there all have one thing in common. They come from these deep consumer insight, which is the heart, in my opinion, of amazing research. And with that, I want to wrap up with a quote which is slightly provocative, but hopefully makes people wake up. The quote is very simple. The quote is, well, that creativity is to have courage in the sea of big data relevance. I want to say thank you, everyone, and good luck with the hunt for small data.